My name is Andreas Ekvall. I'm a Senior Climate Officer at Healthcare with HaDEA Europe, and I will moderate and present during this workshop of CleanMed. How to calculate carbon footprints is one of the most frequent questions we receive from healthcare providers who are advanced and less advanced in the carbon management journey. We are pleased to receive these questions as a solid greenhouse gas inventory is the foundation for tracking and reducing emissions. For less advanced healthcare providers, they often want to know what resources to use and how to get started, while more advanced healthcare providers want to know how to calculate and reduce the elephant in the room, Scope 3. Today we'll try to address both of these questions. I will talk about the fundamentals of carbon footprints, and then we'll hear from Anna-Lisa Mills, who is a sustainability manager at NHS Newcastle Hospitals, who present how they are working to calculate and reduce their emissions through carbon footprint calculations, with an emphasis on Scope 3. Before I start the presentation, please be aware that this workshop is recorded. Please use the live chat tab in the panel to the right of your screen to add any comments or to send questions to us. If we have time, we will try to answer your questions at the end during the Q&A, but please do not hesitate to send us questions in Hublot or by email. Firstly, I want to mention some of the resources that we have developed that can be used to calculate and manage carbon footprints. This figure serves as a visual representation of how we recommend you start your carbon management journey. We recommend that healthcare providers that are new to carbon management should finish our free Climate Impact Checkup online course, and this can be followed by a reading of the Pocket Guide for Healthcare Professionals. Thereafter, we recommend starting to use Climate Impact Checkup tool and the associated data collection tools to begin collecting data and calculating a carbon footprint. If any challenges arise during this process, we also have methodological guidelines, and you can always contact me if you have any questions regarding data collection or carbon footprints. Once you created a carbon footprint, the Healthcare Decarbonisation Toolkit can serve as a guide on how to manage that carbon footprint, and leading by example, along with our over 350 case studies, will be helpful when you're looking for what action to take to reduce your carbon footprint. We can simplify the process of calculating a carbon footprint into 4 distinct phases. The first phase concerns defining the goal and boundaries. This involves clearly defining what you want to achieve with the carbon footprint calculation, including what will be measured, what and what not to include in the carbon footprint. The second phase is data collection. This involves systematically identifying and collecting the relevant data sources for each emission source that falls within your defined boundary. The third phase is impact assessment. This is where we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions related to our goal. And the final phase is interpretation. This is where we analyze the results of the impact assessment to generate reports, mitigation targets, and carbon management plans. Today, we are focusing on the first 3 phases. We're going to start off with goal and boundaries. The first thing we need to define in a carbon footprint calculation is the goal. What are we measuring the emissions from? Is it a specific product, a service, or our entire organization? An equally important concept here is boundaries, which define the scope, or what will be included and excluded in our carbon footprint. An important boundary is organizational boundaries. These define which part of our organization that should be included in our carbon footprint assessment. Finally, we have operational boundaries. These define which specific emission sources, what greenhouse gases to include, and how to categorize them. There are 2 primary methods for establishing organizational boundaries. The first is the equity share approach. With this method, an organization reports greenhouse gas emission in proportion to its percentage of economic ownership in a particular operation or organization. The second method is the control approach. Under this approach, an organization accounts for 100% of the emissions from any operation over which it has operational or financial control. When there are multiple sources of emissions, we need to categorize the emissions because it enables us to report, track, and monitor the emissions in a way that's easy to comprehend. And it also enables us to compare the emissions between facilities and organizations. This categorization is called operational boundaries, and the most common approach is based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which uses scopes, which is synonymous to categories. It specifically uses scope 1, 2, and 3, and there's also subcategories. Essentially, scope 1 emissions are directly produced by an organization. Some examples would be the emissions from the use of vehicles, refrigerants, or on-site energy generation. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions produced through the purchase of energy. Examples are purchased electricity, heat, cooling, or steam. Scope 3 is every other indirect emission source from a value chain. Examples are waste management, chemicals, pharmaceutical, medical goods and services, business travel, and food-related emissions. After determining the goal and the boundaries, the next step is to collect the data needed for calculating your carbon footprint. For data collection, I recommend reading the second part of the Healthcare Decarbonization Toolkit called A Step-by-Step Guide to Carbon Management. In general terms, the first step for collecting data is to secure organizational commitment, because data collection requires several parts of the organization to contribute. Next, we need a solid plan for gathering the data. Excuse me. This involves identifying who within the organization is responsible for managing the data, determining how often the data needs to be collected, and creating a platform to share the data internally, and often establishing the specific methods that will be used to collect the data. Finally, we need to mobilize the data owners to collect the data. We have a resource called the Carbon Management Team, which outlines the actors that are essential for carbon footprints in healthcare facilities. Several types of data are used for carbon footprints. One important type is primary data. This is data that we gather directly from specific activities, processes, and the creation of goods and services happening within our organization or our value chain. Think of it as first-hand information. The most common type of primary data is activity data, which is a quantity measure of a given activity. Secondary data also plays a vital role because primary data isn't always available. So instead of collecting everything ourselves, we can rely on proxy data or data from external sources to help us estimate emissions. Expenditure data is often used as a proxy to estimate emissions. It can be collected from budgets or from how much money is spent on a specific emission category, project, or procurement. Calculating a carbon footprint using Climate Impact Checkup, which is Healthcare Without Harm's carbon footprint tool, requires data across 25 distinct categories, totaling over 100 individual data points, which can be lower or higher depending on the complexity of your emission sources. Activity data is typically used for calculating scope 1 and 2. For scope 3, the tool uses a combination of both expenditure data and activity data. This approach ensures a thorough estimate of the healthcare facility's carbon footprint and zero leakage in estimating the emissions from the supply chain. When you have collected all the relevant data, you are ready to assess your carbon footprint. This is called impact assessment. An essential concept to understand when calculating a carbon footprint is global warming potential. It is used to summarize and compare the ability of greenhouse gases to trap heat in the atmosphere over a specific period. This happens in relative to carbon dioxide. Crucially, the global warming potential of carbon dioxide is 1, and is used as a baseline when determining the global warming potential of another gas. Global warming potential is used to calculate carbon dioxide equivalents, which is a metric used to compare and summarize the impact of gases. The benefit is that instead of dealing with individual gases and their unique properties, carbon dioxide equivalents allows us to express their total warming potential in terms of how much carbon dioxide will have the same impact. This makes it much easier to understand the overall contribution of different greenhouse gases. We derive the carbon dioxide equivalent by multiplying the global warming potential of a gas by the mass of the gas. If we look at methane in the table, the heat trapping potential is 25 times greater than that of carbon dioxide. Another fundamental concept used when calculating carbon footprints is emission factors. Using emission factors is but one calculation approach, but it is the most common approach because monitoring and measuring the emissions of activities is time-consuming, it can be expensive, and by using the right emission factors, the calculations can be very accurate. An emission factor is fundamentally a calculated ratio used as a proxy to estimate the greenhouse gases of an activity or a product. In other words, it's a coefficient that describes the relationship between how much greenhouse gases is released for a specific activity or product. Now to combine our knowledge of data types, emission factors, and activity data in two examples. If we're interested in measuring the greenhouse gas emissions from an ambulance, the relevant activity data is typically the amount of fuel consumed. In this case, this is multiplied by an emission factor that describes the relationship between the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents that are produced for each liter of fuel used. Another example would be measuring the greenhouse gases of chemicals. The relevant activity data could be the amount of euros spent on chemicals, which is multiplied by an emission factor that describes the relationship between the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents produced per euro spent on chemicals. A crucial element to remember here is that activity data must always match the unit of the emission factor, as highlighted by the examples. Now to combine our knowledge of data, emission factors, and global warming potential. Calculating emissions can require two steps. For step 1, we have quantified the activity data, and we multiply that by an emission factor. We have derived the total amount of emissions. However, these emissions can be emissions of a specific greenhouse gas or in carbon dioxide equivalents. This depends on the unit of the emission factor. If the emissions are in carbon dioxide equivalents, we can summarize and compare the impact of this emission source with other sources. While if it's in the mass of a specific greenhouse gas, we can use step 2 to convert the greenhouse gas emissions into carbon dioxide equivalents. In this calculation, we take the mass of the greenhouse gas and we multiply it with its global warming potential, deriving the carbon dioxide equivalents produced by the activity. This is the fundamentals of calculating a carbon footprint. Now to combine our knowledge of carbon footprints. This is an example of a carbon footprint of a healthcare facility. And of course, we can also see scopes here and subcategories. A carbon footprint is a list of greenhouse gases that arise from an activity, the operation of a facility, or a product. And they're commonly communicated as the total amount of emissions of carbon dioxide equivalents, and there's usually a breakdown per scope and subcategory. And what you can see here is, like I said, the total amount of emissions, the emissions per scope, and the subcategories. By categorizing and presenting emissions in scopes, we can track the emissions per category and in year even. It makes it easier to understand the size of the emissions and to identify actions to reduce our emissions. Thank you for listening to this introduction on the fundamentals of carbon footprints. If you have a question regarding how should I calculate my carbon footprint, you can always contact me. Now I would like to welcome Anna-Lisa Mills to present.
Thank you, Andreas. And Diana, I am going to have to ask you to share my slides, please, because I'm having technical issues. And I apologise if we were live while I was having those technical issues. I wasn't sure if we'd started admitting people. So sorry if you heard me at the beginning of the call. So I'll just wait for the slides to load. And if you have access to the chat, I've put 3 different links into the chat, which are relevant to content that I'm about to present. So you might, thank you, Diana, that's great. So if you want to click on to the next, oh, it's not in presentation mode. Let you get it in presentation mode. So we can, not that it's critical. I'll start with,
Give it a second. There we go. Anna-Lisa, the stage is yours now. Please go ahead.
Thank you. If you could just click on to the next slide, Diana, please, that would be great. So thank you. So just as a way of introduction to me, if it isn't already clear, I do have a number of different hats. So I am part-time sustainability manager at Newcastle Hospitals. I've been here nearly 5 years and I work 3 days a week, and that is my main role. However, just in interests of transparency, over 10 years ago, I set up my own business, which is Smart Carbon Limited. It's a small but growing consultancy business that supports businesses in all sizes, all sectors, with the task of measuring and reporting their carbon footprint. And also, I teach at Northumbria University. I've taught the degree course, the master's course, but we've written a 2-day greenhouse gas accounting course, which is accredited by IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. Its current name, it's about to change. And that's the first link that I've put in the chat, is to the 2-day course via the university. There are options to attend that online or in the classroom. So the next slide is just a bit about Newcastle Hospitals. If you don't know about us, we're one of the largest UK NHS trusts. We're a member of the Shelford Group, which is the top group of some of the largest NHS trusts. And importantly, we've a 780 million annual non-pay, once you take pay out of it, budget, which I see as an opportunity to be a lever for change in terms of sustainable procurement. And with us being the first healthcare organisation to declare a climate emergency, we've made a commitment to fast-tracking our action to net zero. So the next slide is a divider, really, just to say, first of all, about our in-house action. So how have we measured and reported our own performance and our progress towards our published ambition, which is to reach net zero by 2030, which is for our own in-house footprint, if you like. Includes scope 1, scope 2 and some scope 3 categories. That's 10 years earlier than the default NHS target. And the reason we've done that is we've actually aligned with our civic partners across Newcastle, including Newcastle City Council. So the next slide shows how we did that, how we first of all measured our own carbon footprint, if you like, applying some of the theory that Andreas has just taken us through. So we used the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most widely recognised standard in the world, the international standard for carbon reporting. That's where we had a lot of experience. As I said, I was recruited into the team from Smart Carbon, but I was able to access some funding from the Net Northeast LEP, Local Enterprise Partnership, which meant that it didn't cost Newcastle Hospitals anything to use the platform because we had funding to evolve it into a bespoke version for the healthcare sector. And Newcastle Hospital is the pilot test bed for that. We followed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but we made sure we also met the requirements of the Greener NHS Team Net Zero Plan, which is on the right-hand side. And you can see that is actually built on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So there's a lot of overlap. The next page shows the results. So we did that in 2019-20 was when we started this exercise. Now, we'd actually already published our 2019-20 results using the old methodology, which was a series of Excel spreadsheets. But once we ran it through the Smart Carbon platform and we followed the required methodology of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we actually brought in a master's student to help us and the Smart Carbon team. The 2019-20 results came out at 43% higher than they previously were. Now, I'm not talking year on year, I'm talking the same year data, just calculated in a more accurate and robust way. So that gave us a reliable, robust baseline that we can now measure our progress against. So you can see every year we repeat the same methodology, and we're tracking percentage change against previous year and against base year. And on the right-hand side column, again, I've put the hyperlink to this report in the chat. You can see we're making great progress in a lot of areas. We're making good progress with anaesthetic gases, with fleet, waste is improving, etc. The two difficult challenges for us, most difficult challenges, are building energy and procurement, which is scope 3, purchased goods and services. So if we move on to the next slide, then I'll focus on procurement. You can see our performance across our footprint. On the left-hand side, the red line is our carbon budget, which we work with Manchester University and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change to make sure that that was aligned to the science for 1.5 degree cap on warming. And the blue bars are basically our building energy. And you can see that that's our biggest challenge. And we are over our budget, but we have got we've just won some PSDS public sector decarbonisation funded money to put more solar panels and heat pumps and so on in place. So we're hoping for a sharp drop to bring us under the curve so that the cumulative emissions under the curve still keep us within our overall budget. But as the pie chart on the right-hand side shows, the pale blue here is our purchased goods and services, which is over 70%. The green wedge is the building energy, which is the blue bars on the left-hand side. So to focus on the purchased goods and services, which is the next slide, we have a target to hit net zero by 2040. That's 5 years earlier than the default NHS goal. And in order to do that, we cannot do that alone. We can only do that if our supplier base also work towards a 2040 target. So the next slide shows how we started the process, and Andreas mentioned about spend-based methods. So initially in 2019, we took how much we spent, which is the chart on the left-hand side, and we divided it into E-class codes by money spent. And you can see most of our money goes on pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, as well as building and engineering and so on. We then applied the nominal carbon factor for each of those E-class codes to get tons of carbon equivalent, which is the chart on the right. Now, to my mind, this does not really actually tell me very much because those carbon factors are quite arbitrary. They were developed in 2017. They haven't been updated. And really, the theory is that understandably, some things that are purchased, some goods and services are more carbon intensive than others. But it doesn't tell me, for instance, if pharmaceutical company A happens to be in the UK and have solar panels on their factory and an electric fleet, and we're buying a similar pharmaceutical from company B, which happens to be further afield and hasn't started their sustainability journey, but company B sells that product at a lower cost, that would mean their footprint is lower. So that's really a nonsense. We wanted to capture real credible action from our suppliers. So the next slide really shows, again, a summary of some of the limitations that we've talked about. But most importantly, it doesn't capture the real life efforts of individual suppliers. And importantly, we can't track any progress because we don't know who's working towards net zero if we're just monitoring how much we spend. So the next slide is really one of the more important ones, which is taken straight from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's 4 methods that are recognised as means of measuring or estimating the impact of your scope 3 emissions. And at the bottom of that, the bottom left corner, the bottom of the hierarchy is that spend-based method we've just discussed. What we've done is we sort of leapfrogged up to the hybrid method there. And that's where we sit at the moment, which is requiring us to ask our suppliers for their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is the dark purple there, and also their upstream scope 3 emissions where they have them. And you can see that's a mix of purple and orange, because we do have to supplement that data if suppliers aren't quite as mature or evolved and don't have all that data. So the next slide shows how we've gone about doing that. We developed a simplified 5-step process. We currently have 850 suppliers working through these steps. That's a quarter of our total supplier base, which is over 3,000 suppliers. And we're asking them in step 1 to log on to a free link and tell us their views on this aspiration to reach net zero by 2040. Do they support it? 98% do. And then step 2 is we've realised, well, they're going to need some support. Some of them are clearly streets ahead of us with this, but some of our micro or SME suppliers may need some support. So we've built a web page, which I've also put in the chat, so you should be able to access that, and that directs suppliers to free checklists. They've got free access to Smart Carbon Light calculator, which auto feeds their results to our dashboard, which simplifies our process of gathering the data and feeding it into our scope 3 result. So that's scope 3 or step 3. They've to feed their data to us. If they already have the answers, they can copy and paste it in. Again, that's free, no cost to the suppliers. We're asking them to share their link to where they've published their net zero target and share a link to where they've published their carbon reduction plan. The next slide shows how that data is gathered. And I know I've only 2 minutes, so I'll be very quick. But essentially, there's 3 ways suppliers can get the data to us. All of that feeds in. On the right-hand side, what you'll see is the heavier blue is actual data we're now getting, which replaces the spend-based estimate. So on the next slide, which is probably the most important one, this was in our report last year. You can see it in the link I've shared. Here we have at the bottom bars, you can see what we looked at already, footprint, but footprint plus is the blue on top. The hashed sections are estimated based on spend, but our most recent year has a solid chunk of darker blue. That's actual supplier data. Now that comes from 40% of our spend, 40% of our suppliers by spend. And what you can see is their actual reported data equals the previous year estimated data for 100% of our spend. We haven't doubled spend. What it's showing is that the spend-based method is inaccurate and that real data is actually indicating that we've underreported our scope 3, because if you extrapolate that up to 100%, it's going to be over 400,000 tonnes. So every year we hold an annual supplier event. We just held one. The recordings are on the link that I've put there. We've given our suppliers free access to the tools that they need to get their data to us. And it's already looking like at least 50% of our spend will be linked to real data coming through on this year's report, which we hope to finish next month and publish. The final couple of slides, so the next one just shows, if we can advance on, it shows just how we're monitoring supplier engagement with those 5 steps. And the bottom table shows we're also monitoring the percentage of spend that we have in the northeast of England or the UK versus the rest of Europe, the rest of the world, with a move to start to track if we're spending locally.
Sorry, Annalisa, we have some issues hearing you. I think we might have lost you.
And there's an additional 5% potentially, and that's asking suppliers to tell us when they tender for a contract, if they were successful, how would they help us achieve our goals? And our goals are in the box on the right, which is copied from our strategy, our climate emergency strategy. So if they were successful in winning the tender, how would they help us achieve our net zero goals? So that was a quick whistle-top tour through that. If you've any questions, please reach out to me. My contact details are on the last slide. And hopefully the links that I hope you can all see in the chat box are helpful. And thank you for the invitation to share that case study.
Thank you, Annalisa. It's truly enjoyable to hear about the innovative solutions that you have implemented. Your approach shows a high degree of accuracy, You pinpoint the most important emissions from suppliers. You're reducing the need of what could have been thousands of LCAs, potentially, while enabling the tracking of Scope 3 targets and the support and transition of the supply chain to net zero. Unfortunately, we have run out of time and come to the end of this workshop, but I'd like to invite everyone to keep the conversation going and please connect directly with us and follow attendees via the platform. I hope that this workshop have provided you with some insights on how to calculate your carbon footprint. And an accurate carbon footprint is the first step towards meaningful change. Understanding the impact of different emission categories provides the foundation to take action, but it's also essential for tracking that your emission reductions are aligned with the Paris Agreement. Once again, thank you, Annalisa, and thank you in the audience for joining us today.